record. There we go. So now we can start recording, and then it'll be online for everyone to see it after it's done. So Al, you have disappeared, but I don't know if you did that purposely, because I know you have resources.
I did that on purpose.
Yeah.
I did that on purpose.
Yep, your resources are pretty tapped, I know. So we'll leave you off the video. Folks, if you have questions, I'm going to ask you to put them in the chat box. I'm going to manage that chat box for Al and ask questions at appropriate times so that he can answer those. I'm also going to advance the PowerPoint for him when he needs that. So thanks for being here. Oh, and by the way, I'm Kathleen. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Woodlands Association. Should have said that. So, Al, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and welcome everybody to this presentation. As you see by the first slide, it's been around for a while. It originated at a convention in Minneapolis for Old Tree Farm Convention. And contrary to what Kathleen said, this is a real ego trip for me. I don't get to talk about cider that much, especially putting the first slide up showing that I actually won something for this. That really makes this a little bit easier emotionally, as you're no longer wondering whether the stuff you're making actually tastes good. You can advance now, Kathleen. My ego is satisfied. Yo, Kathleen.
Yes, I heard you. I heard you. Have to figure out how to do that. Next. There we go.
There we are. Okay. This is what we're covering tonight. And I should add that you can consider this webinar to be Cider 101. It is not going to delve into the details and the complexity of what happens if your cider goes really, really bad, or if you think you have an acid problem, or if you're getting into a lot of very difficult and detailed types of cider. This is basically to get you started, and if you do everything the way I'm suggesting, you probably won't have any problems. As far as the cost of getting started, for around $200, you can probably get yourself some carboys, used press and grinder. Actually, if you're successful, the next thing that you'll suddenly realize you're going to have to be buying, or at least glomming from your friends, or bottles. And we'll go through a lot of that. But you can get started relatively inexpensively, and you really need to check your local used item newspapers like Green Mountain Trading Post up here in the Northeast Kingdom, where you can find cider presses and grinders relatively cheap. There are a lot of them floating around. Go to antique markets. Most of them aren't antiques. They're overpriced, but occasionally you'll find one that's beat up that can be saved. So it's not a bad hobby to get into, and it's not that expensive.
Toastmaster, say hey.
Okay.
Could folks who are listening in please put their screens on mute? We are hearing some background noise.
Okay, Kathleen.
Okay.
Historically, finding clean water has always been a struggle, especially in communities with animals. Hence the importance of ciders, wines, beers, and other waters that were used in fruits or grains to develop alcohol in water. That would ensure that the water was relatively safe to drink. Apples were not native to America. They were brought over. New England and New York were the centers of cider production early in our country. And today, there are an incredible number of apple varietals. There's a lot of research going on. Unfortunately, most of the research efforts on apples are to make eating apples. And that's kind of sad, because the apples that we need to make cider are not eating apples. Just a little bit of a thank you. The New York State Experimental Station in Geneva at Cornell has been one of the longest developers of apple species, and was largely responsible for a lot of the apple varietals that made cider really great in the United States. Okay, Kathleen. I was going to say most of the considerations. You want to, there we go. Most of the apples that make flavorful cider are not good eating apples, and they're not very big, and they're not very pretty. In fact, wild apples and old orchards can make some of the best ciders. In fact, I just had a message from a gentleman that suggested that's where he was getting his apples, and he was absolutely correct. In Sheffield, my forest is in the middle of, my apple orchard is in the middle of the forest, and because of that, it only gets enough sun to produce apples about every other year. So in the down years, I head out to Route 122, and there are about 100 wild apple trees along Route 122 between basically Glover and Sheffield and Lyndonville that I have kind of cataloged and know where to tap, where I can always pick up a few bushels of wild apples. There are also a lot of trees along the back roads of Vermont. And I would almost say before you plant, go out and see if you've got enough wild apples to make the cider you'd like. There's a lot of apple trees in Vermont. Make sure you talk to the landowner before you start picking, but most landowners are happy to allow you to pick a few bushels of apples. You do need a few sweet apples for the sugar, although most of you will be considering 2 fermentations when you're making your cider. So the sweet apples are not quite as important as I make out in here. If all you've got are tart wild apples or very stringent apples, that's probably okay. Another note to know is that the climate change that we've experienced in Vermont has also had an impact on the trees that you plant. When I planted my orchard back in 1984, and I tried to pick apple species that were generally zone 3 and zone 4. And today the zone 3 apples are getting ripe in early August, which doesn't work because I've used my basement as the fermenting station when it normally would be at about 50 degrees. And that used to happen towards the end of August or mid-September, and now doesn't happen until October. So we have this problem of having a lot of apples that are ripe and no place to start the fermentation. And I'm going to get into that on a later slide. But if you're planning on planting apple trees for making hard cider, you really should think about climate change and global warming. Plant trees that are generally found south of you. It's what you might describe as resilience planting of your apples or assisted migration. You're going to generally be planting trees that are south of you. And with that, I would say one of the trees that I planted 30 years ago was golden russet, which was a southern New York apple tree. It did well in Maryland when I lived in Maryland, but up here, it is not quite ready for the Northeast Kingdom. I get apples, but I don't get very many. And it's very, very difficult to harvest ripe apples from the russet tree because it's still generally a southern tree. Other trees that I have included red Duchess, Connell red, Melba, Famoose. I have a couple of doggle crabs, which are good. That helps keep your cider clean. And I also have red Astrakhan, Beacon, Sweet 16, Wealthy, Lobo, Peach Apple, Quinny, and a variety of cherry, pear, and plum trees that I use for infusions in the cider. We are not going to get in, though, as I said, to what the Oeneophiles would like to get into, which would be the play of acids and sugars in your cider. That's something that you can probably read up on your own, and we'll cover that in the references at the end. Okay, Kathleen.
You with us, Al?
Yeah, I flipped my little readout that I'm doing here. I want to make sure I've got this right. You can store apples by the bushel in open areas for quite a while, and I've ended up having to do that. You want to make sure that it's reasonably dry, that it's well ventilated, that it's cool, and they can sit in a bushel basket for several weeks. If you're still in a quandary about how to store it, you can go ahead and start pressing the cider and storing it until you have enough to put in your carboy, or if you're doing several batches, so that you can mix it up and have a lot of different varieties of apples in your cider. I've stored a lot of cider in a used refrigerator at about 30 degrees, and that's worked very, very well. And then I've mixed that with the fresh cider that I pressed at the last minute. It's really kind of a contest here to try and gather the apples, get them stored as cider. You keep harvesting at the last minute so that you do a lot of grinding and pressing right at the last minute. And you put all of that in with the stuff that was in the refrigerator into the carboys, so that I've got apples and cider hidden all over this place until around late October. And then I spend one day filling 7 6-gallon carboys and getting things ready for the first fermentation. You can freeze sweet cider, but the secret of the fermentation are the yeasts that you're using, and those yeasts are found on the surface of the apple. Freezing sweet cider means you're probably going to be damaging a lot of the yeast. Not entirely, but from what I've noticed, it really, really slows down the fermentation, and the fermentation doesn't appear to be as high a quality as the ones from fresh cider. So if you're going to use frozen cider in making hard cider, you need to ensure that a certain percentage of it, perhaps 20% of the cider that you're actually putting in the carboy, is fresh sweet cider. All right, grinding and pressing. Next one, Kathleen. Talking about cleaning. My orchard has no animals, and if you're picking grounders up and you've got no animals except maybe a few deer, perhaps all you really have to do is a light wash. That's assuming you have a clean, healthy, grassy orchard without cows or other animals. You want to wash the apples lightly, but just to get the bugs off and make sure there's no residue or anything on them that could cause you a problem. On the other hand, if you're getting your apples from a cow pasture, you really must take some care in making sure those apples are clean. Perhaps only picking the apples off the tree. I know I've thought on many occasions of going to a couple of neighbors' cow pastures and getting some of the apples. There are massive quantities on the ground and you need a few, but sometimes it's just not worth the trouble or the possible damage you can do to your health. This is one of the reasons why I know 15, 20 years ago, you could buy sweet cider at a farm stand that was not pasteurized. Unfortunately, it only takes a few apples with some E. coli bacteria, and all of a sudden you're giving somebody sweet cider that can really, really cause some serious health problems. So that's not a good thing to do. But again, if you don't have animals, if all you have are a few lazy deer and you're picking them up maybe the same day they're falling, which is what I do. I go down every morning and pick those apples before the deer can get them. There's very, very little washing that really needs to happen. Again, we're not crushing the apples, we're grinding them up. We'll see pictures of a grinder coming up pretty soon. And you'd want to make sure that it's ground to the right size so that you're extracting as much of the liquid from the apple as you can without damaging the seeds. Although I would tell you, I have a neighbor who's used a couple of sheets of plywood and a front end loader and caught the residue when he drove over the plywood sheets with the apples between. And he makes a lot of cider that way, and it's actually pretty good. But again, that's kind of like a desperation move. But good grinding is just as important as the pressing. Scale of operation. Most people probably should start with a 1 or 2 gallon carboy and see if it works. And if you like what you're doing and it tastes good, then you can start expanding. You can go ahead and if you've got access to a lot of apples in a grinder and press, you can go ahead and do 1 carboy. I think if you've got a large carboy, maybe one of the mistakes that people make is they don't fill that carboy all the way up with cider. You can fill a 5 or 6 gallon carboy almost to the top. If you're fermenting at 50 degrees, which is where I recommend, you're not going to get one of these violent fermentations that cause a lot of blowover out of the carboy, which would be a reason to not fill it all the way full. But if you filled it within, say, 5 or 6 inches of the top, so maybe there's only a half pint to a pint space on the top, you've pretty much eliminated the possibility of oxygen getting in there. And oxygen is the death of a good cider. That's what causes it to turn into an acid or a vinegary taste. So anyway, start small, go big. But if you're going to start out big, make sure you fill that carboy all the way up. Okay, Kathleen. That's my press. This is a Happy Valley model. They make about 10 different models. You have 2 of the vats that the pomace go into. So while you're pressing on the left, you're grinding on the right, and these things pop right out. You can really do, I think, with a second person, and I maybe 20% of the time have somebody that will come and help. We've cranked out 30 or 40 gallons in one day on this thing without really stressing ourselves at all. If you've got the apples and they're relatively clean and you've got the containers and everything all arranged, this thing works like a champ. If you're alone, you're going to have a sore arm by the end of the day, but you can crank out a lot of cider. Okay, Kathleen. This is a close-up of the grind wheel. It's basically a glue lamb piece of wood that has small aluminum studs sticking out. They're quite resilient. They bend. So if, and there's about a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch space between the vein sticking up and the grinder body. So you get very, very small, rough pomace, and that's exactly what you want. It exposes a lot of the surface area of the apple. They juice out pretty well. Yeah, these little protrusions do bend over a little bit, but you can straighten them out with a needle nose plier. I've been using this grinder now for about 10 years, and there's literally no deterioration. It takes about 5 minutes to straighten out the few that bend. And the reason why they're bending is you're probably getting a seed caught, and you don't want to break open a seed or grind up the seed. So it's basically salvaging the seed at the expense of the grinder blade. And that's good because the seed creates a very, very bad taste in cider. It's very bitter. So this is this makes for a really, really good pomace. Next one, Kathleen. This picture basically covers all the bases for what you need. There's a couple of things that I probably should have tried to get a wider angle on, but you can see the edges of a couple of bushel baskets right in the lower right-hand corner. You can see on the left-hand lower corner, that's a garden weight cart with a frame with chicken wire in the bottom of it that holds about a bushel of apples so that I can lay them out and wash them off with a hose. That's a whitewash brush in that container, a little bit higher. In fact, you can still see an apple in there. Basically, I brush them off. I rinse them, brush them off a couple of times. It gives you a chance to visually observe every apple to see if you picked up a rotten one or if one went bad while it was in the bushel basket. From there, you can see the hopper on top of the grinder. It passes through the grinder right into the staves. If you look carefully at the staves that are the one that's there, you'll see a rust brown color on the top. That's the liner inside the staves. It's like a cheesecloth, very, very open, passes the cider right through. Basically, I have never washed that. I get done every year pressing the cider out. I wad that up in a ball and I throw it in my freezer. That has a lot of really, really good yeast on it, and my ciders have been getting consecutively, I hope, better. I think they have been getting better. That may be one of the reasons is that I've got this enormous amount of yeast on the pressing cloth, and that makes it an insurance that you're getting the right yeast that you want in your cider. There's a little container down there below to catch it. You can see the gallon jugs. And the reason why those jugs are there is, as I said, it's real early in the season. This was probably done in August. And once I get it into those gallon jugs, it's going in the refrigerator in the barn, waiting until I have enough cider of the different varietals to combine them all and begin the fermentation. And if this was taken in mid to late August, I'm still easily 6 weeks or longer away from having a cold enough basement to do the fermentation. Okay, Kathleen.
Now, let me ask you a quick question. I think you said that the yeast was on the exterior of the apple.
You broke up. Say that again.
Oh, did you say earlier that the yeast was on the exterior of the apple, that that's where it comes from?
Yeah, it's on the surface. It's on the skin of the apple.
Okay, so you don't wash that off when you wash the apples?
Well, apples also have a layer of wax on them. And you have to really be a diligent washer with a pretty strong bristle brush to really get the wax off. That doesn't happen. So
Okay.
a light brushing doesn't remove all the yeast. The yeast is stuck to the wax. So if you're just doing a light brushing, you're not going to lose too much.
All right.
If you had apples, if you had dirty apples, it's hard to describe. If they were soiled with soil, if they were in mud, you probably could wash that off. You probably would wash a lot of the yeast off. But if you end up having to wash too much because they've been in a cow pasture or something like that, that kind of defeats the purpose. And you might bring in something that you shouldn't be bringing in anyway. So those are the kind of apples that you really have to start thinking about whether you really want to press them or not. But yeah, the yeast is on the surface of the apple.
Got it. I think I went ahead inadvertently here.
No, that's right. Yeah, I was
Okay.
ready. This is the equipment you need to make it. You don't really need a hydrometer and unless you're really getting meticulous about what's going on. In all honesty, I own a couple of hydrometers, but I've never had the container to put them in that's deep enough to get a decent reading on what the specific gravity of the liquid is. In general, I think I'm producing ciders in 2 fermentations that come out to around 6% alcohol. So I'm continuing my ignorance and just going with the thermometer to make sure that the fermentation temperature is correct. And fermentation temperature may be the most important factor in making hard cider. In colonial days, people put it in their basement. The Restorton reference that I first got that got me started said, you put it in your basement, that's cold enough. Well, most basements that are about 50 degrees, and 50 degrees turns out to be the magic number. If you're within a couple degrees, either way of 50 degrees, it's hard to go wrong. If you're above 55, closer to 60, those are temperatures that are normally used by people making wine. And making wine at 60 degrees is an entirely different animal than making cider. Cider was never really designed to be fermented at that kind of temperature, at least from an amateur standpoint. I don't know what temperatures are used by the commercial outfits. They make a lot more than we do, so they may have to use temperature as a device to move the fermentation along. But using natural yeast and the equipment that you have, the best way to go is at about 50 degrees. That has always worked. As far as yeasts go, when I started, I was going to 2 or 3 of the the amateur wine supply places like Vermont Homebrew Supply. They have a variety of yeast for sale that are not only for wines, but now also for ciders. But 20 years ago, I couldn't find those, and I was buying wine yeast. Generally, I was ending up having to get champagne yeast because that's all they seem to carry. But about 10 years ago, I read a really fascinating article that came from the wine country out in California that indicated that all the professional winemakers in Napa were going away from using yeasts that they were buying and simply going with the yeasts that were on the grapes. Very interesting, because the Romans certainly didn't buy yeast, and yet they made good wine. And I think that's kind of thing that kicked off using natural yeast instead of yeast that you buy. So about 10 years ago, I stopped using commercial yeast. And from the standpoint of making hard cider, most people that like my ciders like a fruity, slightly dry apple cider. They don't like a champagne cider where you have a certain high level of carbonation, but you really don't have very much apple taste. It's a very, very dry cider that I suppose if you like champagne, you'd like that. But I'm not sure that's what people really go for in cider, and that's clearly not what they were making in colonial America. So I'm like, if you want to get a nice fruity cider, 50 degrees, use a natural yeast. The rest of the stuff that's on that list is really cheap. The siphon rig simply means it's a device that fits down into the carboy and allows you to begin a siphoning operation to move the cider from the carboy to another carboy or to a bottle for bottling. Let's see, anything else to cover on that? I think that's about it. Again, I'm a wild yeast kind of person. If you are looking for yeast, the place that I know of in Vermont that you can go is Vermont Homebrew Supply. They sell bottles, they sell carboys, they sell everything on that page, and they can give you good advice. Okay, Kathleen. That's what my basement looks like. Everything's there. That's that's where it all takes place. The empty containers that I put cider in temporarily until I can put them in the carboy are kind of on that shelf. There's a lot of orange juice and iced tea containers there. There is one plastic carboy there. Do not hold that against me. I do not put cider in that. That was left over for that's in the picture. All my carboys are glass. If you look at the stand there on the left, the big red thing is a bottler. The interesting thing about that is that there are two size bottle caps that you can find in the United States. Generally, the typical beer or soda bottle cap is an American size. There's a slightly larger one that goes on wine bottles and European bottles. That red plastic capper will do both. If you have that opportunity, it's worth getting because it's an opportunity. Okay, Dave's asking, what's wrong with plastic carboys? I don't think you can get them clean. I think it's very worrisome. The one or two times I've had at the end of a fermenting season with a plastic carboy, that first fermentation usually results in an awful lot of scum and really baked on crud on the inside of the carboy, and glass, that comes off very easily. With plastic, I've ended up noticing that I was scratching the plastic, and I'm not sure I got it all out. It was also a gallon smaller than the rest, and it was like I couldn't get a handle to stay on it, and that was another issue trying to pick it up. So it was like, no, I'm not using that anymore. But getting back to the bottler, if you have those two cap sizes available to bottle, that means that you've got an opportunity to snare both your and your friends' convex bottomed wine bottles, which allows you to do a lot more bottling. I've been pretty much reduced to getting my friends to give me empty beer bottles, and I'll go into that in another slide or two. But I lucked out. Some friends of mine had a wedding at my place last year, and they bought a whole bunch of wines that were carbonated. They were European, and they had very convex bottoms, which meant that they were designed for pressure. So I got about 5 gallons worth of these bottles from that wedding, and it really paid off because I didn't have to scrounge for bottles so much. But everything, we're gonna see some of the details that's in this on the next slide. Go ahead, Kathleen. There's a little closer look at it. You got a carboy with a handle and an airlock, and there'll be a closer view of that, and that's the capper there on the right. Kathleen, maybe we ought to do some questions now. I notice we're up to 5. You're on mute.
Yeah, I don't think there are that many questions. Actually, some were about muting. So the last question here is about wine bottles that come with a cork, will they hold a bottle cap?
If it was corked, no. I think those don't have a rim on the top, so you can cap them. And a lot of the ones that are corked that are designed for pressure have the wire cages on them so that the cork can't come out. If you've got a corker, and that capper of mine can be used as a corker, but it has a different fitting, and you can find the right size corks for the bottles you have, you can cork cider. That's very easy and very safe and quite doable. Just making sure that the wine bottles that you have are designed for pressure.
And there's also a comment that the siphon, is that also called a racking cane?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I learned something tonight. I didn't know that. Next slide.
Okay. Yeah. There.
Okay, that's a close-up view of the airlock on top of the carboy and a handle. I want to emphasize the handle. I had back surgery a couple of years ago, and I'm here to tell you, you need to have a handle. These things are 70 pounds when they're full, and generally, if you're going to need to elevate that bottle in order to get the siphon working and move your cider into bottles. So picking it up without a handle is really, really dicey. They're 70 pounds. And for us older people, having that handle really, really pays off. I'm to the point where to get away from having to even think about picking one up, I went on Amazon and bought a very, very small winch, electric winch with a kind of a runner that runs across the entire length of that table that you saw, so I can pick up a carboy and move it anywhere and not have to pick it up at all. So, and that was all for like 150 bucks. And that means that I'm that much safer. As far as the airlock goes, you fill that up about 1/3 of the way. It doesn't take much water for the airlock to work, but you've got to make sure that it does have water in it so that you don't get any oxygen in that cider. That is the kiss of death on the cider if it gets very much air. And if you're doing a nice slow fermentation the way you should at 50 degrees, you generally won't have it blowing out the airlock, which can happen if you're doing it above 50 degrees and the stuff gets a little carried away. Okay, next. So fill up the bottom 2 bubbles on the airlock. Yeah, that's close enough. Kathleen, go back 1. I think, yeah, well, there's 3 bubbles stacked. I wouldn't go any higher than the first bubble. You want, because if you think about it, that's going to take it to the second bubble when it starts to blow out CO2. And that only leaves you 1 more bubble that's empty in case it really gets violent. I usually don't put more than about half on the first bubble in just to make sure there's water in it. There will be some condensation in there. I've never had them run dry, but I have overfilled them and ended up with about, actually, I think from what I'm looking at, that thing actually has water in it right now, and it's about half of the first bubble. Okay, go back to the next one. I'm learning about this, the way this Zoom thing works. I actually get to see the chat comments when they come out.
Yes, if you have your
Kathleen?
chat window opened, you'll see them.
Okay, okay.
And I
real
see
good.
you answered the last question there about the bubbles.
Yes, I did, because it came up on the screen. That's
Yeah.
neat. Okay, this
Okay.
is fresh sweet cider that's beginning the fermentation. If you look at the bottom of the carboy, you can see the lees. This is early on in the fermentation though. The lees will probably double in size by the time this first fermentation is done. You can see the scum at the top and you're asking yourself, well, he's got 4 or 5 inches. Is that only a pint left? That's the carboy on the right is the half one is a lot fuller than it looks. The one in the middle there is very full. I don't think I could get another pint in that one. And then the one on the left is a little bit low. And I did that on purpose on the first fermentation because I knew what I was going to do on the second fermentation. When I make an infusion, you have to leave room on a second fermentation for the increase in volume from the sugar and the infusion liquid, like a, say, strawberry or raspberry juice or blackberry juice or something like that. So on that carboy on the left, it looks a little empty. On the next second fermentation, that was almost all the way up to within an inch of the handle when I put the sugar in and the infusion. So it was really critical to make sure that it didn't get too warm. Otherwise, it would have started going over the top. But on the second fermentations that I do, they're kept at 50, and they usually do go very, very slowly. Okay, Kathleen. Okay, this is probably where I get the most questions. I start a fermentation in October. That first fermentation on just the sweet cider alone at 50 degrees usually ends in late December. So what's that, November? It's about an 8 to 10 week period. That's usually the fermentation that's the most visually noticeable. You have pretty significant bubbles coming up until it quiets down. After that first fermentation, I rack it off into another carboy that loses the lees, although if you taste it and it's a little vinegary, I should say that you don't necessarily want to lose those lees. But let's say you do. You're racking it off after the first fermentation. You're adding sugar for a second fermentation because the first fermentation used up most of the natural sugar that was in that liquid. I go for about 1 pound of sugar per gallon. And then I let it go again. Now, there are actually 2 fermentations going on during that second fermentation period. One is just the sugar being reduced to CO2 and alcohol. The second fermentation that also occurs is when lactic acid bacteria in the cider ferment the natural malic acid into carbon dioxide and lactic acid. The lactic acid is more subdued and mellow than malic acid. So a mellow lactic acid fermentation gives a smoother, gentler, and mellower than malic acid taste. It's very, very desirable. The second fermentation occurs naturally, spontaneously after the first fermentation, and is much slower. On the first fermentation, you can see the bubbles. Very, very clearly, you can see the bubbles drifting up through the cider. On the second fermentation, you really need a flashlight, assuming you don't have a lot of lights in your basement. And you need to look at that cider very carefully, and the bubbles are almost microscopic. That's an exaggeration, but they're extremely tiny. You'll see little piles of them occurring on the surface of the cider, which is maybe a better indication than trying to see the bubbles because they're so small. That second fermentation will go on for several months. My second fermentation usually doesn't end it starts in late December or early January and goes all the way through May. What do I use? And I would say for questions on that, you really need to go see the reference books that I've got at the end of this presentation. The book that I use that does the best in explaining that is, and let me pull my video up here for a second. This is the Prue and Nichols book, Cider. This was out of print for a while. It's back in print. It answers all the questions that you have. Am I calling the 5-gallon jugs cowboys? Oh, there's got to be a Southerner in the audience here. Yeah, Trevor, they're cowboys. Let's see what else we got to talk about in this.
Al, can you, there's a request here to define racking and lees.
Okay, the lees are the sediments in the bottom of the carboy. It's basically bits of apple. That's basically all it is. It's the stuff that managed to get through your cheesecloth and the press. You'll also find out when you look at the lees whether you kept the bees out. I should warn you that when you're pressing cider in the fall, you suddenly realize you have a lot of friends. Wasps and yellow jackets love to be around when you're pressing hard cider. And if you're not careful, they will get into the sweet cider. And you don't find the little guys' bodies until you're getting rid of the leaves on the first fermentation. They don't do your cider any good. So it's worth putting a screen on anything that you've got that keeps them out of the jars or the carboys when you're pouring the cider in there.
And what about racking?
Racking is just refers to moving the cider from one carboy to another, or moving it from a carboy to a bottle. It's a verb. You rack out the cider. I'm sure somebody who's in the wine business probably has a better definition of that, but it's just the process of moving the cider from one carboy to another. So if I fill that carboy up, when I rack that carboy, I'm taking it out of that carboy and putting it into another carboy. That's all it means. Let's see, what else we got here? Prue and Nichols say decanting after the first fermentation and adding more sugar promotes a great taste, eliminates the lees, clarifies and adds more alcohol and gas. So that's another good reason to racking it out of that first carboy. It cleans it up quite a bit. And what I have found is that if you're careful about doing that after the second fermentation and you're using a siphon to put it into bottles, if you're very, very careful and you keep the lees in the second fermentation in the bottom, you can pretty much avoid having to do any filtration. Pretty much I've never had to filter, and I will admit that the bottles do have a little bit of scum on the bottom when you're done drinking it, but it comes right out. It's not very noticeable. That's another good reason to let the cider sit for a few months in the bottle. It settles out and it clarifies it. But you have removed most of that material from the cider through the addition of the sugar and the continuing second fermentation. I use a variety of different things for that second fermentation, generally white sugar, just powdered sugar, not powdered sugar, granular sugar. But I've used honey, I've used maple syrup, pear juice. Actually, there's a lot. You can pretty much experiment with what you're putting in for a sweetener on the second fermentation. The second fermentation is also when I add an infusion to try and give yourself maybe a little bit of a unique taste. I've gone with raspberry juice, blackberry juice, strawberry juice. What else will I use? Cinnamon, blueberries. Blueberry juice does a really, really nice job. Cinnamon is very, very difficult to get it to stay in the cider. You don't really need much of it. There's a distinct cinnamon flavor when you have the cider, even though it appears that most of the cinnamon was left in the carboy when you metered it out. But it really does come across really, really nicely.
Al, is there anything you've used that you wouldn't recommend?
Well, if you look at the beer industry, there pretty much isn't a beer out there that doesn't have something really weird in it now. I think you could probably say the same thing about cider. I don't know of anything that I wouldn't do. Yeah, question, can you use a cinnamon stick? Absolutely. That might be a more practical way than trying to use cinnamon powder, because the stick at least will stay in the cider and it won't float. Extracts, never used extracts. That'd be worth a try, because you'd have to convert the extract to know what it would be in comparison to the regular natural volume of that. It has to work out to be about anywhere from a really robust pint to maybe as much as a quart of that infusion to get the effect that you want in a 5 or 6 gallon carboy. Oh, what else here? I'm trying to think I've left anything out. I think that's it. Next one, Kathleen. Bottling. The first rule is, actually, this could be kind of an expensive and a logistical nightmare for people. I've had more people ask me about, what am I going to do for bottles? Where do I put this stuff after I get done fermenting it? That's a really good question. I've been pretty religious about making sure that if I buy beer, it's a craft beer, so that I get a bottle that's easy to cap. You know, if you get Budweiser bottles, they're screw top. You can cap with a capper. You can cap with a capper on a screw cap bottle, but it's a lot easier if it's a Sam Adams type bottle, the old-fashioned rimmed old bottle that you buy a Coke in or an old beer. That's much easier to cap. It's a lot easier on the capper. You can also buy bottles at the Vermont home brewer's place. You can buy 22-ounce bottles. Interestingly enough, you'll suddenly realize that when you buy a case of bottled beer, half of what you paid for was for the bottle. That's why so many breweries are now going to cans. It's a lot cheaper to can than it is to bottle, and the can is cheaper than the glass and all of the hang that goes along with that. I get about half my bottles from drinking craft beer all year, from begging bottles from my friends. I have a lot of people that if I go visit and take them a 6-pack of cider, I'll get a 12-pack of beer bottles in return. The problem is that they have to be clean. If any of you have tried to clean out a beer bottle that's been sitting with dry beer in the bottom, you know what I'm talking about. The bottle needs to be cleaned within a couple of hours of drinking the beer. Otherwise, that stuff begins to bake on the inside of the bottle, and it's very difficult to get it out. I've had well-intentioned friends give me bottles that I'll take a look and I'll rinse it, and you can see that stuff in there, and I've just had to throw them away. I have a couple of parties every year, and one of the things I like about that is a lot of people bring their own. So I'm standing there with several empty carton containers. I capture all their bottles, and as soon as the party's over, I spend the next 2 hours cleaning bottles. Yeah, there's some good comments that you're getting here on bottles that have different kinds of tops. I think clearly, if you're into this for any length of time, the cheapest route is to have a lot of friends that are willing to clean bottles and give them to you, to clean the bottles that you use yourself. And if you still have shortages, go to a store and buy them. They're about, I think they turn out to be around $10 a case for bottles, something like that. As far as carbonation and fermentation, this is a very controversial subject too. Generally, people after that that second fermentation, I use PBW to clean. What's PBW? Need help here. What's PBW?
I don't know. Jill?
Well, she'll come up with an answer pretty soon.
Okay.
If you wait until the cider goes flat after the second carbonation, second fermentation, it's pretty easy to add a couple of drops of corn syrup diluted into a bottle and then filling it with your flat cider and then waiting a few weeks. That's what I used to do. I would warn you that you cannot use corn syrup or maple syrup direct. You have to dilute it way down. And if anybody's interested, I have a little chemistry sheet that breaks down how much you can dilute corn syrup to get a few drops in each bottle so that you get good you'll get a good carbonation in your cider because when you put it in the bottle, it was flat. Now, that being said, that second fermentation may be going on past time when your basement is cold enough to continue fermenting, and you may be forced to bottle with that second fermentation going on. I have found myself in that position more and more, where I'm more than willing to let that happen, knowing that most of the second fermentation is over with, but I don't add anything in the bottle then, and I let that second fermentation, Oh, that's a cleaning, is that like anhydrous hydrogen peroxide? Yeah, we're looking now.
It doesn't say.
Okay, well, did you get that at one of the home brewing places?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. They sell a dry anhydrous hydrogen peroxide mix that works well. You could actually use Clorox. Clorox is a great emulsifier of everything organic, but I have to warn you, you're going to be rinsing that container for a long, long time. You want to get no smell of Clorox in the bottle when you're done. That's kind of like the last, I use Clorox on occasion when I got a friend who's given me a really nice big bottle and I don't want to get rid of it. And I'll let a little diluted Clorox sit in the bottle for maybe a week and then go at it with a bottle brush and scrub it. And it'll literally generally always fall out. It cleans very, very well. But it's kind of like using it's kind of overkill. And that's why they make things like this BW and some of the other more gentler contaminant removers from bottles.
Yeah.
But as far as carbon, there we go. We got some good stuff on that brewery wash. Carbonation and fermentation. So you are in a quandary. Your second fermentation is finished. You think it has. It looks pretty flat. Nothing's going on. You've checked for little bubbles. You don't see any. It is probably safe to put a very few number of drops of diluted corn syrup in the bottle for the fermentation. Now I have to tell you, there used to be some incredibly nice starch tabs, little tablets, look like aspirin, that you could buy and pop a couple of those tablets in a bottle, and they represented a gram or a couple of grams of pure starch that the yeast would eat and give you the amount of fermentation you needed for your cider. Somebody in the wine industry complained about those, in the amateur wine industry, complained a long time about those. Can secondary fermentation take place in a refrigerator? Depends on the temperature of the refrigerator. And as a result of the complaint, the industry stopped making the tabs. So somebody should have kept quiet, because the tabs may not have worked for wine, but they worked incredibly well for cider. Now, if you're really gutsy and you think you know where you are on that second fermentation, you can go ahead and bottle your second fermentation cider, still maybe with some microscopic bubbles in the bottle, and wait. If you were correct, you're going to have to wait a while, perhaps 3 months, to find out how correct you were. You may know sooner if the bottle blows up. I have had I've had one bad experience with bottles blowing up. When I got started, this was like almost 20 years ago now, I went ahead and put 1 drop of maple syrup in every bottle and put flat cider in that and figured, oh, this is gonna be cheaper than the tabs and I'm gonna win this battle. And it was in a cardboard box in my basement. And I went down there one morning and the box was gone and the entire basement was coated with glass dust. The box had spontaneously blown up, 24 bottles. I mean, even the caps they were stuck in the ceiling. It looked like somebody had set off a stick of dynamite. So you want to be really careful about how much sugar you put in the bottle if you're going to do that. And you may want to experiment. If you ask the people at the Vermont store about bottling before the second fermentation is finished, they will look at you like you're crazy. But again, it's a thing of experience. If you think you know where you are on that second fermentation, you can get away with it. What I have found is that I now know pretty much when it ends. And when I have bottled cider, it turns out that I've actually let it go too far to the end. And I end up with cider that's very slightly carbonated, but not carbonated as much as I like. Such is life. It's usually pretty easy for me to tell in May whether I'm going to be adding a couple of drops or whether I'm going to be just bottling. And I'm batting about 90% right now.
Al,
Yeah.
you answered that question of the refrigerator with depends on the temperature. So For me, could you tell me? It just begs the question, what should the temperature be?
50 degrees.
Oh, okay, thank you.
If you want to have a bottled cider continuing to ferment, assuming that you bottled it and the second fermentation is still going on, or you've bottled a flat cider with past the end of the second fermentation, and you want carbonation to develop in that cider while it's in the bottle capped, you need to keep about the same temperature of the bottle as you would had it been in the carboy, 50 degrees.
Okay.
Now, what I have found is that I used to start drinking the cider maybe 2 months after I bottled it. And I have come to realize that it tastes a lot better if you give it even longer. Unbelievably, it's almost like it ages well. And that's one of the things that I will mention. Actually, Kathleen, go to the next slide because I'm getting ahead of myself here.
Just a minute. Yep. Ah,
Cider gets
Yeah.
better. There we go. A good tasting cider now will taste a lot better in 20 years. I've actually got 20-year-old cider. I can tell you that an average or a bad tasting cider will get a lot worse as the time goes on. But if you've got a good tasting cider, it actually improves. And I have found that if I bottle in May and hold off on opening that batch until January of the next year, the cider is significantly better tasting. That also gives it a chance that if it had been a little bit low on carbonation, that maybe it might get a little bit more from sitting out. Because during that period of time, it's been sitting in my basement, but the basement's also gone up to 60 degrees during the summer before it finally fell down in the fall. So I have definitely completed any fermentation that's been going on and letting that cider sit for that length of time. But yeah, I mean, when I put in the winemaker competition in February, actually the two winners that I had were both 3 or 4 years old. They weren't new ciders. And I've got a couple from around 2005 that are just exceptional right now. I actually have one that's 30 years old that I did when I still lived in Maryland. Unfortunately, it was in a pop top or a one of those Grolsch bottles, and literally the rubber rotted out on it, so it wasn't carbonated, but it had turned a very, very dark color. It was almost like a liqueur. It was really pretty good. Okay, Kathleen, next.
sorry, I was on mute. There's a question for you.
Oh,
A screw top or a ceramic top, can you burp the bottles to keep it from exploding? Or will that affect the taste or make it spoiled?
that's a really good question. Been there, done that, failed miserably. When I had the case explode in my basement, I had 2 other batches that were in a similar situation. And this was January, and I waited until it was like 20 below. And I took one of the bottles outside and left it out so that it was 20 below. And then I very, very carefully tried loosening the cap and eventually tried drilling a tiny hole in the cap just to see if I could release some of the pressure so they wouldn't blow up. The hole drilling worked better. I accidentally took the cap off, and at 20 below zero, the cider erupted out of the bottle and immediately froze. And I had this like 24-inch long stick of cider that had come out of the bottle and immediately froze upon contact with the air. So I ended up basically throwing that cider away. It was just too dangerous. You can experiment if you get too much pressure in there. But one of the nice things about putting a regular metal cap on the bottle is that most of the cappers will leave that cap depressed in the center when you're done capping. And if you watch that cap over a few weeks, the ones that have a lot of pressure, instead of being convex when you look at it, it'll turn concave. It's an indication that the pressure is building up in there. Then after, if you've got a batch where they turn concave, that's the batch you want to watch. The ones where it stays convex, that's not going to be a problem. The ones that are concave so that it literally looks kind of rounded on top, those are the ones that you probably want to open one and see what happens. I had a batch of raspberry infusion a couple of years ago that I bottled too soon, and I take the cap off, and if I didn't have a big glass there ready to catch it, it would foam and pour right into the glass. I mean, it was quite drinkable. It was actually one of the better batches that I had made, but it was way overcarbonated, and it was getting to the point where it could have been dangerous. So I ended up using that batch at our snowmobile club meetings, and I would pour the cider out for the members so that they wouldn't experience the damage, and that way we could drink it, but we got rid of it. Is your thing is bottling too late? I had a question from one of our attendees, or that comment came up earlier this evening. The longest I've seen cider ferment without bottling is about a year. And I ended up bottling it, and it actually had a little carbonation, and it was okay, but it was kind of, it was not a good batch. It was kind of strange tasting. That's maybe the best way to put it. I would not recommend that. If your secondary fermentation's not done by, I would say May or maybe June, I think I would probably bottle it. You don't want to let it sit all summer in a refrigerator. I don't think it does it any good. You run the risk of other things contaminating it or it getting to be a problem. Better to get it in a bottle and then see if that doesn't help it a little bit. Again, if you're tasting after the first fermentation and it's a little vinegary, you may want to, if you've saved the lees, if they're still around, or if you've tasted with a thief and you found it tastes a little vinegary, you can leave the lees in. Sometimes that'll remove the vinegary taste a little bit. It'll cut down on the acid. No, I don't think I'd let it sit out for a year. I don't think that does it any good. Okay, next, Kathleen. I keep a little reserve. This is 20 years worth of cider. In the foreground on the right, you'll notice there are a lot of bottles. Those are batches that have not been. They're fermented. They're all bottled. They have not been opened yet. Nobody's tasted this stuff. This is the 2019 right there on the right. But as you look back, you'll see the shelves get narrower and they get smaller and there's less bottles. Most of those shelves have 3 or 4 batches on them, not just one like on the right. And those are what's left of batches. I usually try and keep 6 to 12 bottles of everything I've done just to see how it's doing over the years. And if I have an especially good batch, and if you look over on the left side, you'll notice a bunch of Corona bottles on the bottom shelf. That was a 2005 batch that was just exceptional. In fact, that one might be one I try and enter some year. And I've not drank any of it. It's like, I keep that for special occasions, and I'm just, if you start on it, you're gonna run out pretty soon. So it's just sitting down there waiting to be probably inherited. It's a good cider. But if you also look at the rack next to that, you'll notice kind of in the background, there's some really large bottles. Those are some of the wine bottles that are cappable, that are European. So yeah, it looks like I got a lot of extra cider, but actually not. That's from a practical standpoint, that's 20 years of roughly 3 or 4, 5, 7 batches a year, and that's all that's left. So each 6-gallon carboy puts out like close to 4 24 bottle cases of cider. Quite a bit. 3 or 4, maybe it's 3. You can do the math. Next slide, Kathleen. Again, this is personal preference. If you use a champagne yeast, you're going to get a champagne cider. It's not going to taste like apples. It's going to be very dry. It'll be fizzy. and it'll get you drunk, but there's no fun in that. It's not something that you enjoy a lot of conversations with people. It doesn't make you convivial. It's just champagne. On the other hand, if it's fruity, if it's carbonated, has a slight dry side, but it has some taste to it. If it really tastes appley, that's what our colonists were making. And that's actually, if you're going to enter this stuff in a competition, what the judges are looking for. They're looking to realize that you've actually done an apple fermentation and that they can taste the apples. If you manage to get oxygen in your sweet cider when it's fermenting, oxygen causes an aerobic fermentation that gives you pure vinegar. In fact, that's the interesting thing. Making cider is anaerobic in the absence of oxygen. Vinegar is aerobic in the presence of oxygen. So that's kind of like whether you can tell if something's gone wrong or not, if it has a vinegar taste. That does not necessarily mean that you can't do something with what you've got as a product. And that's the next slide, Kathleen. Switchel. Switchel is an ancient farm drink that farmers used to drink while they were haying. And if you've ever hayed on a July afternoon on a big farm, you get really thirsty. And this is what they used to drink. And they'd use cider vinegar, straight cider vinegar, along with all of that stuff. I've tried it. It is pretty good, and it definitely is thirst quenching. And there are other recipes for switchel. This is just one that I pulled out of one of the books. I think it might have been in the Prue and Nichols book, but that's something you can use, the cider that you made that didn't quite pass muster. Next slide, Kathleen. That's my orchard. That's actually half my orchard. The other half is in back of the picture on the right. You're going to have a lot of fun planting trees. I should have mentioned that if you're going to plant trees to raise them for apple cider, and you manage to find what you're looking for, understand that if you're getting if you're ordering from, and actually let's do that right now. Let's go to the last slide, Kathleen, the references. St. Lawrence Nurseries is a great place to go for the ancient varietals. The problem is that all they sell are full-sized apple trees, and those full-sized trees normally take about 10 years to start bearing. If you get a semi-dwarf, if you can find a nursery that does semi-dwarf ancient varietals, they produce in about 5 years, and the dwarf trees produce in about 3 years. Miller Nurseries in Rochester used to do a lot of dwarf and semi-dwarf. They went out of business. They got bought by, I think, Stark, and they don't do very good work. Don't quote me on that, but I never saw anything in their catalogs that looked nearly as good as what was in the old Miller catalogs. St. Lawrence has a very, very good large variety of ancient apples. And you'll have a lot of fun picking one there. And Fedco. Fedco's good too. Fedco's good too. I bought apples from them. I haven't done it for some time because it's a lot easier going St. Lawrence. But again, there are drawbacks to doing dwarf and semi-dwarf. One of them is deer. They can reach all the branches. And another is a semi-dwarf, or the dwarf trees don't last that long. I think they have about a lifespan of maybe 10 years before they start to fall off. But if you want instant gratification, that's the best way to get quick apples. You can graft too, but that does take time for the tree to fill out. These are the books that are worth investing in. The Annie Prue and Lou Nichols book is probably the best one I've ever seen. Lewis Hill, primarily for the list of trees for the zone, although the St. Lawrence Nursery catalog does them by zone too. And the Vrest Orton book is the original cider book. I'm not even sure that's in print anymore. Vrest Orton is the original founder of the Vermont Country Store, and he got all the information in his book from his grandfather. Vrest has passed away many, many years ago, so his grandfather was alive and well in the mid-1800s. So that was clearly a good source for information on cider. And that wraps up our webinar. So we can continue with questions or whatever anybody wants to do.
I'm gonna take this off the screen. And then if folks have questions, we are at about 8:15. If folks have questions, would you like to just ask those rather than put them in the chat? Or are we kind of crispy at this hour? Wow. Al, can I put your email in here?
Not seeing any comments.
Great talk, gotta run. How about if I put your
Share
email?
my email. Yep, that'll work.
Okay,
My email is fair game. That's good. Happy to answer
Okay.
questions. I may plead ignorance.
but feel free to send any questions to Al if you don't.
I had a quick question about cider trees for do you have any preferences that you think like at the St. Lawrence Nursery that are ones you would say, geez, those are some good solid ones to start with, or yeah, something along those lines?
When I started a long time ago and I planted that orchard, all the reading I did suggested that one of the best cider apples was a golden russet. And I planted 4 of those suckers, and I have been incredibly disappointed with the harvest from those golden russets. They don't produce that many apples, and they are relatively small, and the tree is not even even a little bit predictable as far as how many apples you'll get. I'm trying to think of what I can tell you what I've had success with. Red Duchess, any Duchess is a good apple. It's a good cider tree. It's a sweet apple. It's a huge apple, but it's predictable, and it's a good foundation apple for a cider, a Red Duchess or a plain Duchess. Beacon, Beacon, that's a good apple. Peach apple is a really good apple. Quinte, Quinte. Fameuse, snow apple, Fameuse, that's a good apple. Melba, these are all ones that I've got that have been good producers for me. But again, if you get the St. Lawrence catalog, it goes into a fair amount of detail on each apple that they offer as to whether it's a good cooking apple, a good cider apple, or a good eating apple. If it says it's a good cooking apple, but it's like a zone 3, I would say it's probably going to be a good a good cider apple too. It probably won't be real sweet, and it probably will have some good taste to it. What you definitely don't want to make a lot of hard cider with are Golden Delicious or any of the big kind of flowery crap from Washington. I see Dave looking at me. Dave Plumbo, that was a good question you asked. You've been doing this for some time. Was that a trick question? Okay. You're on mute. You're on mute.
All right, unmuted.
There you go.
Not a trick.
I don't use the kit, so I didn't want to tell you anything.
Right. Well, I've used wild yeast in the past, but this year with our wild apples being non-existent, I decided to go more traditional. So I'm trying the yeast. So we'll see how that goes.
Okay.
Definitely
if you're
gonna add-
located anywhere near the north, if you're anywhere near the Northeast Kingdom, we got a lot of apples on the back roads up here.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've got my carboys done, so I'm not gonna. I've got to work in the woods, so I'm not gonna be out picking apples. But
Okay.
I make a lot of kombucha, so I'm using trading off some of the skills from each, and it's kind of fun.
Okay.
Al, here's a question about the Scott Farm in Dummerston. Have you tried that? They have a lot of heirlooms.
No, I haven't. Yeah, if I think I've read about it. If they've got heirloom apples, then if they were I mean, if these are old, really large apple trees, like 2-foot diameter apple trees, then those would date from the period of time when the United States was really making a lot of hard cider. Those would be apples that you'd want to have in cider. There was an heirloom nursery in Lindenville a long time ago, and I got a couple of my trees from him, and he had literally 300 or 400 apple varietals there. And I don't even know if that place is around anymore, but it's worth taking your time and looking for old apples. The older, I tell you, some of the best apples from these really, really old orchards, they're small, they're ugly, they're scabby. You'd never eat them, but when you grind them up, they make great cider.
Al, I have a question. We have a ton of old, I think old varieties, but they're younger trees. You know, they're just volunteers that have been growing around the edge of the field, and some are green, some are red. Is there a way to know the combination of red to green, or is
No.
the color not a big deal as much as the flavor or the type of varietal?
The only way you get, if you find an apple that's an old varietal from a company that is certifying that it's an old varietal, the only way you're going to get that apple from another tree is if you graft from the varietal onto that tree. The seeds from an apple tree are not seeds that produce that tree.
Right.
Because the pollen has come from a whole bunch of other unknowns. So that wild tree that you've got on the edge of the orchard could be anything, and there's no way of telling what it is. It's literally a bastard. Nobody knows what it is.
Right. So is there a way of looking at those and determining which of those would be a good cider tree?
Yeah. Yes. That I can tell you. Yes. Take a bite of it. If it's real tart or stringent, it's probably a good apple for cider. I mean, you definitely wouldn't want to eat the rest of it. I generally, I've gone out, if I find a wild apple and but if there's one that's really kind of gross tasting, it's like, that's the one I would want to pick for ciders. You've been up a couple of times on Dave Peral's apple orchard that's, basically remnants from an ancient orchard up there. Most of those apples that he's making cider with do not taste good. They're really scabby little apples, but he's turned out some good cider, some really good cider from them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think those trees are? I mean, those trees are volunteers. They're not any.
Right.
They're not the direct trees that were planted by people.
No, they're not. They're wild apples. That's absolutely right. Yeah. If he had one tree on that property that was a couple of feet in diameter, I'd say that is an ancient varietal. But he doesn't have any of that size. They're all around 6 inches in diameter. So they're probably the second generation from whatever was there originally that somebody used for firewood or mowed down or something like that. It might have even been a pasture. And there may have been, it could have been that the farmer that was there made cider and spread a lot of the seeds around or fed apples to his cattle. And the seeds survived the cattle and ended up in the ground and came up as apple trees. And what we're seeing are what came up that way.
Right.
So a good rule of thumb would be if the apple kind of looks ugly and then you bite it and you instantly want to spit it out, would be a good cider apple.
Those are the ones I'm collecting in Sheffield.
All right.
I got 2 or 3 of those.
All right. Good to know.
It helps if they're big too. I mean, there's one tree pretty much all the way up on Sheffield Heights that bears every year. It's even bearing this year because it grows on the edge of a stream. And it's a relatively large red apple with a relatively good taste. And it's not all that scabby, but it's it's definitely not anything anybody planted. And I've been collecting from that tree now for off and on 10 or 15 years. It always comes through. And it kind of defies the logic of, well, a scabby small apple is probably a good cider apple. Realizing that 150 years ago, most of the apples that people were growing that they had brought from Europe were scabby little apples. That was the nature of the beast. Nobody had Golden Delicious in England at that time.
So we are kind of at 8:30 here, nearly, 8:25. Yes, great presentation, but now I know your secrets. There you go. This has been taped. We will put this on the Vermont Woodlands YouTube channel.